Welcome, everyone. Tonight, we are doing chapter 31 of 70 Faces. We are going to be learning tonight about alternative alphabets. It's a very, very interesting subject. So we'll start with an introduction, what we're talking about. We have our usual alphabet, Aleph, Bet, Gimel, Daled, until Tav. Amazingly enough, what we're going to be learning, if I didn't say this, most people would think that this is a Kabbalistic invention or a Kabbalistic creative explanation of the Torah. But these alphabets come from our sages, and they're written about in the Gemara. So this is going back quite literally thousands of years. This idea of an alternative alphabets. So that's like one of the most important points, is that here we're learning 70 different methodologies. And even though Kabbalah and Hasidut sometimes really like adopted one of these methods or put a lot of energy into developing one of these methods, but virtually every single thing that we've learned this entire year is sourced in Chazal, the sages, going back to the Mishnah, the Gemara, and even before. So for anyone who wants to look up the source here, it's in Masechet Shabbat, Tractate Shabbat, page 104a. There, it's very, very hard to understand. The symbolism is just out of this world, how they explain these alphabets. But what I'm going to do now is I'm going to share there we go. We're going to be looking at three different, we'll call them alternative alphabets. The first one on the top is called Athbash. The second one is called Albam, and the third is called Athbash. And we'll have tonight examples from all of them. We're going to start with Athbash. This is the one that's most known and most employed, from the sages to Kabbalists to Hasidut. So if you look, because Hebrew goes from the right to the left, so here on top, you have the first letter, the Aleph, and it is exchanged for the letter below it, a Tav. That's how you get At. And then you have the Bet is exchanged for a Shin, Athbash. That's why this alphabet is called Athbash. And it continues, Aleph, Bet, Gimel, Daled, from the beginning of the alphabet. And here is from the end of the alphabet, and these letters are exchanged one for the other. So what this means is that there are many words, terms, and verses that can be read completely different than our usual rendering of them with the normative alphabet. Now we'll look at Albam, and here we're dividing just like here, we divided the alphabet in half. There's 11 letters on the first row and 11 letters on the second row. Here in Albam, it's the same thing, but instead of taking the first letter and exchanging it for the last letter, the second letter and exchanging it for the second last letter, and so forth. Here, we're taking the first 11 letters and exchanging them for the second 11 letters. There's 22 letters in the alphabet. So here's how you get Albam. Aleph is the first of the first 11 letters, and Lamed is the first of the second 11 letters. Bet is the second of the first 11 letters. Mem is the second of the second 11 letters, and so forth. This is what's called Albam. Athbash is the most complicated, is because everything here is going to add up to either 10, 100, or 1,000, except for the last three letters here. And these are all fives, 5, 50, 500. So here we'll start. Aleph is exchanged for a tet. If you add them up, it equals 10. At, bach, the second letter for the second last letter, adding up to 10. 2 and 8 equals 10. 3 and 7 equals 10. Now, when you get to here, Yud equals 10, Sadi equals 90. So now these are adding up to be 10. These are adding up to be 100. And these add up to be 1,000. That's how this Athbash chart works. So I'm going to give another half a minute for everyone to look at this, and then I'm going to stop the share. So again, Athbash is named for the first four letters. The first letter exchanged for the last letter. The second letter exchanged for the second last letter. Albam is splitting the alphabet in half. The first 11 letters are the top row, exchanged for the second 11 letters. And Athbash is working on a decimal system. The first four here all equal 10. The next four equal 100. And the next four equal 1,000. Okay. So that is a little bit complicated. Now we're going to bring examples and see, going all the ways back to the Gemara, and then develop by Kabbalah and Chassidut these alternative alphabets. So the first one we're going to do is on page 294 for those who have 70 faces. This is the one on the top. And this is about the first word of the Torah, Bereshit. So we usually translate Bereshit as in the beginning, which is a very good translation. Be means in the. Reshit means, it can mean beginning, the first, in the beginning. In Onkelos is the Aramaic translation, and he translates Bereshit similarly in Aramaic to mean in the beginning. But the Targum Yerushalmi, another translation into Aramaic, translates the word Bereshit as Bechachma, in wisdom. God created the heavens and the earth, not in the beginning. With wisdom, God created the heavens and the earth. Now, this makes sense because we have a phrase, Reshit Chachma, Yirat Hashem. The beginning of wisdom is the awe of God. Now, for those who were here last week, we were learning about permutations. And the word Yirat is in, the four letters are in the word Bereshit. yirat, the awe of God. And of course, every day we say, kulam bechachma asita, talking about creation. God, in wisdom, you created everything. So we can understand the Targum Yerushalmi as translating Bereshit as bechachma. It's more of a drush, of a symbolic, allegorical explanation. Now, the interesting thing is that, one second. So here we see the word chachma in gematria equals 73. The alternative alphabet that we just learned about called Albam equals 73. So in Kabbalah, they explained that with this alphabet of Albam, God created the world. So we want to understand, well, what does that mean? Obviously, we're used to the idea that God spoke the world into being according to the normative alphabet. That's how we would normally think of it. And yet in Kabbalah, it says that God created the world with this alphabet. So what it means is like this. We know that the first letter of the Torah is a bet. And this is such a symbolic idea because bet equals 2. So before there was creation, there was only the oneness of God. There was nothing else. Only God, no multiplicity, only unity and the essence of God. As soon as there's a creation, there is, as it were, something other than God. There's a relationship here. It's the 2. 1 becomes 2. And that's represented by the bet. So this alphabet, Albam, what does it do? It splits the alphabet in half. The first 11 letters exchanged for the second 11 letters, meaning the entire alphabet that we call Albam is based on a one-to-one duality. It like splits the alphabet into half. It creates a duality within the alphabet. So that's how we can understand the statement that with this alphabet, Albam, God created the world, because the big bet of Bereshit runs through the entire Torah, because our reality that we live 24/7 is a world of dualities. Our spiritual task is to see the oneness behind the duality. And that's why I came up with this formula. 1 becomes 2 in order to become 1. That is the formula of how creation works. And our spiritual mission, our spiritual task, is not to take the duality of the world and see it as the final reality. Our task is to see that it's all ultimately one. That's why we say the Shema twice a day. Shema Yisrael, Hashem Elokeinu, Hashem Echad. But even in the Shema, you have 2 different names of God. For those who attend the Tuesday class, that's exactly what we're learning about now, are the names of God. So in the Shema, which is the cardinal statement of faith, you have 2 names of God, and then we say that God is one. Because there are many names of God, but there's a oneness that connects them all together. So that's our first example tonight, this idea that, again, Chachma equals 73. And the name of this alphabet, Albam, equals 73. So that's how we got to this explanation of understanding what it means that the world was created through this alphabet. So that was our first example. The next example is on page 295. And it's actually later in the Parsha too. There's two different explanations of the name Moshe. Now, if you take Moshe and you use the Athbash system, where you exchange the first letter of the alphabet for the last letter, the second letter for the second last letter. This is called Athbash. So the name Moshe translates into the word Tzvi. Tzvi is a deer. Tzvi is a deer. And the way it works is the mem of Moshe translates into the yud of Tzvi. It's like backwards. The shin of Moshe, because it's the second last letter, translates to the second letter, which is a bet. And the hey of Moshe, the fifth letter, is exchanged for the fifth last letter, which is a tzadi. So you get Tzvi. It's like a mirror image, just like the first for the last. So here Moshe's name in Athbash spelled Tzvi, but actually backwards. So what's the significance of this? What's the significance of this? So first of all, Tzvi equals in numerical value 102, which equals emunah, faith, emunah. So it's very interesting in the Zohar, Moshe many times, in fact, there are whole sections of the Zohar that are called Raya Mehemna, the faithful shepherd. Moshe is called the faithful shepherd. Where does this come from? So first of all, he was a shepherd for his father-in-law, Yitro, for, depending on the midrash, but up to 40 years. That is what he did. He was a shepherd. And the famous story is that Moshe is guarding the flock, and he notices that a small lamb is missing. And instead of sending one of the other shepherds, he himself goes to look for the lamb, and he finds the lamb licking water from a little crevice in a rock that was holding a little water. And Moshe, when he finds the lamb, says, "Oh, now I understand why you ran away. You were thirsty. It must be that I wasn't providing enough water." Instead of getting angry at the lamb for running away and making him chase it, he had compassion, and in the sense he blamed himself. And the midrash says that he put the lamb on his shoulder, and he began walking back to the camp. And the midrash says, God says, "This is the shepherd that I want for my flock." That's the midrash's explanation of why God chose Moshe. Of course, there are many other reasons, but this midrash tells us something very deep. So from that midrash, Moshe receives this name, Raya Mehemna, the faithful shepherd. And faithful is based on the word emunah. Emunah in numerical value equals tzvi. So that's one connection. Another connection is that the land of Israel is compared to a deer, to a tzvi. Why? Is that it's said, and if anyone has seen a deer, knows this, that the skin of a deer, the hide of a deer is very taut. In other words, there's no flab there. There's no extra weight. A deer is sleek. And it's said that if one has the hide of a deer and would want to put it back onto the deer, it would be impossible because it's so tight that there's no give or take. And so why, what does that have to do with the land of Israel? So we're told that the land of Israel is the little that holds a lot. That it's a very, very small country, relatively. I believe in actual square miles, it equals New Jersey. It's as big as New Jersey. But it's infinite what's inside of it. Eretz Yisrael is infinite. And so it's called Eretz Tzvi, the land of the Tzvi. And also because the Tzvi, the way it leaps. If anyone has seen, I get to see every once in a while, I walk in the forest all around where I live. And there are deer there, but they're very hard to see. They stay very hidden, and it's such a thrill. Every once in a while, you're walking, you don't expect it, and all of a sudden, a couple of deer like prance over the road. It's just such a thrill. It's such a thrill. So that represents the liveliness of Eretz Yisrael. When you see a tzvi running, like your heart skips, because it's so graceful, it's so beautiful. So we know that Moshe wanted more than anything to come into Eretz Yisrael. And he didn't succeed. He was able to see the land at a distance. God showed him the land at a distance, but he couldn't come into the land. And so the idea that he's called, that in Athbash, in this alternative alphabet, Moshe equals Tzvi, is a hint of both him being the faithful shepherd and also his tremendous desire to be in Eretz Yisrael. Now, the next one is on page 296, the next example. And we're going to probably get to this later in a later chapter. So I won't go into this so much, but what's interesting is this coming week, we begin a new book of the Torah, Vayikra, Leviticus. And it begins on the 8th day of the inauguration of the tabernacle in the desert, and Rosh Chodesh Nisan. That's when the book of Vayikra opens, and Rosh Chodesh Nisan, at the dedication of the temple. What's interesting is there's a concept which we are going to learn in the next month or so, called Ein Mukdam V'Muchar B'Torah. There's no chronological before and after in the Torah. Now, it doesn't mean there is no chronological order. What it means, though, is there's certain places in the Torah where if you just read it in English, we would assume that it is chronological. Everything is exactly chronological, but we're told that is not correct. There are different parts of the Torah that are written as if they're chronological, but they actually happened at a different time frame. And then the whole wisdom is, well, why isn't it written here? Why does the Torah write about it here? So in like 2 months from now, when we get to the book of Bamidbar, almost 3 months from now, there's going to be a section that relates back to the inauguration of the tabernacle on Rosh Chodesh Nisan, which we'll be learning about this week. It's in Parshat Naso in the book of Bamidbar in Numbers. And there it explains that the 12 princes of the tribes on the 12 days after the inauguration brought gifts to the tabernacle. And each day it describes what the gifts are. Turns out the gifts are exactly the same every single day, but a different prince from a different tribe brings them. Over there are the most amazing Rashis in the entire Torah. His explanation of the gifts that are brought, he depends very much on gematria, which every once in a while Rashi will bring a gematria, a numerical value, but here it's almost every single explanation. And in it, he brings an Athbash. He brings one of these alternative alphabets. Now, this is Rashi, who's known for explaining the simple, literal meaning of the text. So the fact that Rashi brings Athbash, it just emphasizes that it's a legitimate tradition, that this is a legitimate method in order to explain the Torah. So on what word does he bring it? So part of the gifts that all the princes brought was incense. And so Rashi points out the way you spell incense in Hebrew is Kuf, Tet, Resh, Tav, Kitoret. Again, it means incense. So Rashi says an amazing thing, because his explanation of these gifts are the height of symbolism. That's how he chooses to explain what he considers the literal meaning. In other words, the Torah is repeating 12 times the exact same gifts. So obviously Rashi feels that there must be something like really, really special about these gifts. And if you just look at them, it's a bowl and a spoon, and the spoon has some ketoret in it. And it would seem like, does the Torah really have to take so much space to explain this? So Rashi is giving us a much deeper explanation. So he says, very simply, he says of the word ketoret, if you take the second letter, the first letter, the kuf is the fourth last letter of the alphabet. So in Athbash, it means that it's exchanged for the first letter of the alphabet, which is a Dalet. So he says if you exchange the Kuf for a Dalet in Athbash, the word Ketoret now equals 613, which are the number of mitzvot. So I wanted to explain this because sometimes when we hear about these alternative alphabets, that's why for those people who came in late, I made a big point that the source of these alternative alphabets is written about already in the Gemara. And of course, they received it from earlier. They didn't like just make it up. They received oral traditions going all the ways back that this was a legitimate method for finding deeper dimensions of the Torah. So here we see a Rashi who's famous for explaining the literal, simple meaning of the text. He's using Athbash to explain one of the gifts of the princes. I believe in a later chapter, we will be going into much more in the numerical values which Rashi brings. He brings gematria after gematria to explain each of these gifts. Now, the next one is a very timely one. This is on the bottom of page 298. And this is coming from Megillat Esther, which next week already is Purim. So in the Megillah, after Haman and his sons have been hung, the Jewish people have been able to defend themselves. And the Megillah says, La Yehudim Haita, Ora v'Simcha v'Sason v'Yikar. And there was for the Jews light and joy and happiness and preciousness. This is the phrase that is used to explain the celebration of Purim after so much tension and stress and danger, complete danger. And now the danger is past. So it says, and for the Jews, there was light and happiness and joy and preciousness. Now, we use this phrase for Havdalah. Every Shabbos, when we go out of Shabbos and we do the ceremony of Havdalah to separate between Shabbat and the week, we incorporate this phrase. One of the reasons is because when Shabbos ends, sometimes there's a little sadness. Our second soul is leaving us. We've just had such a wonderful, relaxing, joyous, spiritual Shabbat. And now back to the week, all the challenges or problems that we have that we were able to put out of our mind during Shabbos. Now we're starting a new week. So this phrase was incorporated into Havdalah to give us hope and a sense of joy going into the new week. So in the Gemara, they explain a little bit deeper. What does it mean? Light, happiness, joy, and preciousness. So the Gemara explains, light equals Torah. And each one they bring a verse, because in the Tanakh, the Torah is compared to light. Torah or the light of Torah. In fact, many yeshivot are called Torah or from this verse. The next one is Simcha. Simcha is of holidays. And that's what's called Simchat Yom Tov, the joy of a holiday. Sason is a hint to circumcision. Again, there's a verse that about Brit Milah, about circumcision, that mentions the joy of this ceremony. And preciousness, v'ikar, is compared to tefillin. That tefillin are called a precious commodity. Okay, so having said all of that, so we'll go back to the first one, that ora, la Yehudim hoita ora. So the Gemara says that equals Torah. So here, if you take the first letter of ora, is an aleph. If you exchange it for the last letter in Athbash, is a tav. Now the other three letters of ora and Torah are the same. Vav, resh, hey. So ora becomes Torah. That's one of the secrets why the Gemara said ora zu Torah. Because in Athbash, they're exchanged. The aleph for the taf, ora becomes Torah. So this was like almost an obvious one. This is an amazing one. This is an obvious one. Okay, now I'm going to do one that's not in the book. And this is a very, very important one. In the Parsha B'Shalach, when we come out of Egypt, so we know that the Egyptians start to chase us and we're trapped at the sea. As the Torah is describing the chase is on, so when we get to the sea and we're blocked, there are 3 verses in a row. And I believe it's somewhere in the 70 phase. I can't remember now that we discussed this, that there are 3 verses in a row that have 72 letters. 72 letters. And I once read the possibility of just like by coincidence having 3 verses in a row in any literary manuscript. It's something like 1 out of 4 million or 14 million or 40 million that you would have 3 verses in a row with exactly 72 letters. And the verses talk about how the cloud and the pillar of fire came and divided between Israel and Egypt. And that even though they were trapped at the sea, for that time before we crossed the sea, God came and protected them. So from this, according to Kabbalah, but this again is already mentioned in the Talmud, that you have 3 verses of 72 letters. And we're told that from this comes 72 3-letter names of God. And so how does it work? And you'll understand, because this is very connected to Athbash. So how do you get 72 3-letter names of God? So you take the first letter of the first verse. You take the last letter of the second verse and the first letter of the third verse, and that forms a name of God. The second one is you take the second letter of the first verse, the second last letter of the second verse, and the first letter of the third verse, and so forth, until you have 72 3-letter names of God. So you'll excuse me for 1 second, and I will bring you an example. Okay, I'm sorry. This might be hard to see, but these are the 72 3-letter names of God. This is the first one, and it continues until the last one. And again, why am I bringing this up now? Because the method of extracting these 72 3-letter names of God is like Athbash, taking the first letter of the first verse, the last letter of the second verse, and the first letter of the third verse. So these are called the 72 three-letter names of God. Okay, now we have time for two more. So on page 299, so I chose this one because in the beginning, we showed three different alphabets: Athbash, Albam, and Athbach. So all the examples that we've brought so far are of the first two, Athbash and Albam. And here we're going to bring from Athbach. Here's the example on page 299. So this is a very, very interesting one. More than just the alternative alphabet is the message here. So here, Rabbi Shmuel bar Nachmani in the Gemara says like this: the evil inclination incites a person to sin in this world, and then subsequently bears witness against him in the world to come. How do we know that? Because there's a verse in Mishlei that says, he who pampers his servant from youth shall have him as a ruler at last. So what does this mean? So Reb Shmuel is saying that like the evil inclination wants its cake and the cherry on top also. He causes us to sin, and then he comes and he prosecutes us for sinning. Like he gets it from, like, how could he be happier? Not only does he get us to sin, but then later he comes, and here's the point. So he learns it from he who pampers his servant. So here the servant is called the evil inclination, meaning when someone is young and they make no attempt to rule over their evil inclination. Instead, they let the evil inclination rule over them. So it says later on in life, that evil inclination will become his ruler because he didn't like draw the proper red lines early enough. So the evil inclination becomes so strong that it eventually rules over him. So how did we get this thing that the evil inclination becomes a witness against him in the world to come? So Rabbi Chia, in this discussion in the Gemara, points out that in the alphabet called Athbach, remember this is on the decimal system, tens, hundreds, and 1,000, that if you take this word for ruler, which means manon in Hebrew, and with this alphabet, Athbach, it means sahada, which means a witness. And through the use of this alphabet, Rabbi Chia makes a statement that the evil inclination will get a person to sin and later will become the prosecutor. Now in Pirkei Avot, it says something similar, but in a different way. And that is that when a person does a good deed, he creates a defending angel. And if a person does a sin, he creates a prosecuting angel. Well, what happens to these angels? After they're created, what happens to them? So the idea here is when we all leave this world, as we all will someday, and we're called to judgment, who will come to defend us and who will come to prosecute us? The very angels that we created. We create our defenders and we create our prosecutors. And so here, the idea is just a great idea, but here Rabbi Chia uses this alternative alphabet to learn this out from. So this is an amazing thing. And I'll just add a midrash here. In fact, I believe it's in the Gemara, where it says, Chaval, like what a shame that the snake in the Garden of Eden did what he did, because he could have been the greatest servant to mankind. So you hear that statement like, whoa, what is it talking about? First of all, we're told that the snake is symbolic of the evil inclination. So what does it mean that, like, what a shame that the snake made us sin? Because in potential, he could have been the best friend that we had, the best servant. So there's two explanations. One is that we see that the numerical value of Nachash, the snake, is 358, which equals Mashiach, which is 358. So you say, whoa, how can the Nachash and Mashiach share the same gematria? There's such opposites, total opposites. A few weeks ago, we learned about different meaning of words. That sometimes a word will have totally opposite meanings as a root word for two different types of ideas. So it's the same thing with gematria. Here we have the snake equals 358 and Mashiach equals 358. So what we learn from this is, just like we think of the tree of life and the tree of knowledge of good and evil as being like the most opposite trees you can imagine. But we're actually told that their root system was intertwined. And in essence, they were coming from the same root, the tree of life and the tree of knowledge of good and evil. And that's why we're told that had they waited until Shabbat, Adam and Eve could have eaten first from the tree of life, and then they would have been able to handle properly the tree of knowledge of good and evil. So what appears to be absolute opposites, we see that their root system is the same. And so we're told the same thing about the snake and Mashiach, is the energies are both, they're both dynamic, deep, profound, powerful energies. They just manifest in very opposite ways. But just like we'll take like the word passion. So passion can lead a person to commit the worst sins available. Or it can lead someone to the highest spiritual heights. The same attribute, passion or desire. Desire can be something very positive, and it can be something extremely negative. So that's how we understand this idea of when the verse is brought, he who pampers his servant from youth. Here, what we're being told is the evil inclination, what's behind it could become the greatest servant for us if we know how to channel it, if we know how to ride the wild horse. If you tame the wild horse, whoa, you really have something. You're riding on this magnificent horse. But if you don't tame it, it will throw you off every single time. Every single time. So we're going to end with one more, and this is a very, very important one. This is on page 301, and this has to do with the word mitzvah. If you look at the word mitzvah, mem sadi vav he. Now we'll look at the name of God. A yud and a he, and a vav and a he. Meaning that the last two letters of mitzvah and the name of God are the same, vav he. So it's brought down that if you take the mem and sadi of mitzvah and you exchange them in the Athbash system, it spells the name of God. The mem becomes a yud, and the sadi becomes a he. So this obviously is telling us something incredibly important, is that a mitzvah has the power to connect us directly to God. This is like, it's such an important idea. In fact, mitzvah itself, the root means, one of the meanings is to connect. Saveh means to command, but it also means to connect. So a mitzvah connects us to God, but here we employ the alternative alphabet of Athbash to actually see it. So that's like a simple usage of Athbash, but the meaning that we can get out of it should really, really strengthen us to know that that is one of the main functions of a mitzvah, is to keep us connected to God. For example, we say 100 blessings a day. So in other words, it's 100 opportunities to directly connect to God. Would it be so? I'll end with a blessing. Would it be so that every time we said a blessing, we were aware and had the consciousness that at that moment, if our thoughts are directed properly, we're connecting directly to God? Would it be so? I bless us all to be on that level.